There are parts of the world that receive no water at all, and there are parts that receive a lot of water. But strange enough, even these places can be plagued by drought. A country like Holland receives on an average 75 centimeters of rainfall in a year. The people over there think they live in a very wet country, but it is nothing compared to the rainfall that pours down on Cherrapunji in the wet season.
Monsoon cloud comes through the Bay of Bengal and Bangladesh. But there is no hill and mountain at Bangladesh, and that's why rain mainly comes to Cherrapunji due to mountain or hill. In 1974, the total rainfall of the year 24.55 meters, and it is extremely in monsoon season. In July, in the month of July, it is 8.204 meters. July also 3.055 meters. August 3.597 meters. One day rainfall 1563 millimeters. That means 1.56 meters in one day or 24 hours.
That is in one day 2 times as much as in the whole year in Holland.
It may be. And rain comes here sometime 2 or 2.5 months continue. You cannot see the sun ray or sunshine within 20 or 25 days.
Cherrapunji, a former British settlement in the northeast of India, can be found in every atlas. Not because it's a big place, only a few thousand people live there, but since time immemorial, it's been celebrated as the wettest place on Earth. Its annual rainfall is 11.5 meters, 15 times that of Western Europe. Cherrapunji's special status was discovered by the British who settled there in 1820. They recognized in this wet, green and hilly region their homeland and called it the Scotland of the East. But even for the British, 2 months of non-stop rain was too much of a good thing. In 1850, only 30 years later, they left Cherrapunji. The present inhabitants of Cherrapunji, the Khasi tribe, have become used to all that rain. If everything's under cover, life can go on as usual. As long as you're armed with an umbrella and don't get in the way, it's no trouble at all. 11.5 meters of rain, however, is bound to have consequences. At the height of the rainy season, life grinds to a halt.
If it rains very hard, it's impossible to plant anything in the soil. It gets washed away immediately. It's even difficult to go outside to fetch anything. During the rainy season, my husband can't find any work.
So you don't grow anything?
No. It would just go to rot or be washed away.
And afterwards, where do you get new soil?
We find some again. We use manure or food leftovers. We mix it together and we plant things in it. We manage. Oh, he's asleep.
Despite all the problems, the start of the rainy season in Cherrapunji is cause for a big celebration. For 2 whole days, the people jump and jiggle their way through the mud in a noisy dance intended to drive out evil. For a place which is plagued by the wettest rainy season on Earth, it seems a curious ritual. And yet it isn't. For strange as it may sound, rain is not Cherrapunji's most significant problem. For although it is the wettest spot on Earth, it doesn't rain all the time. Far from it. More often than not, it doesn't rain at all.
But rain comes here highest and goes Bangladesh by canals. There is no any preservoir here to preserve water.
All 11.5 meters of Cherrapunji's rain falls in a period of 4 months. The rest of the year, it's dry. Dry as a bone. In the dry season, the green hills of what's called the Scotland of the East are parched and brown. It took some time before the Indian government was prepared to include the wettest spot on Earth in its drought program and provide the inhabitants with drinking water. There was no money to build a reservoir, but for 20 years, Cherrapunji has been kept alive by a pipeline. In the dry season, the water is distributed with care. But how is it possible that nothing of the 11.5 meters of rain is left for the rest of the year? And has that always been the case?
What a strange paradox. This is the wettest spot on Earth and yet a desert for most of the year. Look at this forest. This kind of forest existed once upon a time all over Cherrapunji. Most of the forest is now gone. This particular patch is a sacred forest protected by the people for cultural or religious reasons. These forests soaks in water during the rainy season, and over a period of time when the rainfall is not there, this water is gradually released from the system. Now what has happened is most of this forest is gone. The rain that comes flushes away everything, and the result is the kind of landscape that you have on my left, the desert.
In the Garo Hills, about 200 kilometers away from Cherrapunji, there is still lots of forest. Almost everywhere in the Garo Hills, there is water to drink because the forest retains the plentiful rainfall. But for how long will it continue to do so?
A few years ago, we burnt down that bit of forest over there and grew crops in it for 2 years. We'll stay off it for a while to allow it to recover. Now we're using this bit at the front, and we hope there'll be enough ash to give us a rich harvest.
In the Garo Hills, the people engage in a traditional form of agriculture known locally as jom, but better known in the rest of the world as slash-and-burn cultivation. In slash-and-burn cultivation, a new section of forest is burnt down every year to make room for crops. The ash that is left after the fire is an excellent fertilizer. After 1 or 2 years, this fertilizer is exhausted and the farmers shift to the next bit of forest. The abandoned field is left alone to allow the forest to return. The forest needs at least 12 years to recover fully, but in most cases, it's not given that amount of time.
Jom all over the world is considered to be a very destructive practice. But in fact, it is not so. Jom dates back to a period between the hunter-gatherer society and the real agriculture. Any system that is that old should be good. The problem now is overpopulation and overexploitation.
If you let the forest recover for 12 years, the trees get bigger, and more leaves mean more ash to use as fertilizer. But nowadays, we only let it recover for 6 years, so it produces less and less, and things get harder and harder for us.
Ultimately, fields are left without protection, and the fertile topsoil is washed away by the heavy rains. Once the fertility is gone, the forest never returns, and the threat of a second Cherrapunji becomes a serious possibility. Whereas in the Garo Hills, preventative measures still make sense, in Cherrapunji, all hope of recovery has long since been abandoned. 11.5 meters of rainfall every year has washed away every last bit of fertile soil. For good.
What we have here is an attempt on the part of the Meghalaya government to reforest the Cherrapunji area. As you could see, this is a failed attempt. Left with no other option for making a living either through agriculture or through forestry, the people have chosen the only available option before them, namely mining.
Why do people stay in a place which doesn't support life either in the rainy or the dry season? Because there's work. Cherrapunji has piped-in drinking water and little to eat. But there is work, and for the poorest of people, that's the most important thing to have. These eroded hills contain coal and chalk, ingredients for the cement industry. Whole families have devoted themselves to the mining of these valuable resources. It has even attracted immigrants from Nepal and Bangladesh who've come here because there is no work at home. The green hills of Cherrapunji are rapidly being dismantled. Not only does this mean the destruction of the very last thin layer of soil, the poisonous slag that is spread everywhere makes any kind of plant growth impossible.
In Cherrapunji, drought is not a meteorological problem. It is a poverty-related problem. There is plenty of water available, and yet the people don't have the resources to use this water.
If the wettest place on Earth is a victim of drought, is there hope for the rest of the world? Everywhere on the planet, the amount of available clean drinking water is rapidly decreasing. Yet it is still possible to find new sources of water, even in the least likely of places.
On the west coast of South America, there's an enormous desert which begins in Peru. There you find vast expanses of sand. The desert extends halfway down into Chile. This desert is the driest place on Earth. There are even spots where no rain has ever been recorded.
The Atacama Desert is that dry because practically no rain can reach the area. In the east, the desert borders on the Andes. The wind blowing in from the east loses all its moisture over these mountains. The clouds drifting in from the ocean over the desert bring no rain. A cloud must become at least a few kilometers high to produce rain. Off the Chilean coast, a layer of warm air stops that happening. On the driest spot on Earth, every source of water is welcome. That's why, since the 70s, a group of Chilean geographers led by Professor Pilar Ceracida have been trying to collect water from clouds. They realized that the clouds are always at the same altitude. It's a predictable phenomenon, and therefore a reliable source of water. Sarah Sita and her colleagues didn't only have a scientific interest in collecting water from fog. They also had in mind to offer a solution to the problems of the poorest living on the Chilean coast.
La sequía es un problema de pobreza.
Take, for instance, the situation in Chungungo, a small fishing village on the Chilean coast.
Chile entre el desierto de Atacama y el océano. Hasta los años 70,
Up until the 70s, the villagers had water enough.
En la cercanía
Nearby was an iron mine, which was owned by an American company.
Los pescadores
The fishermen sold fish to the mine, and in return the mine gave them water,
les daba agua.
an abundance of water.
Despite the lack of water, the fishermen of Chungungo wanted to stay in their village, because even though life was difficult, there was work. Work that here too was hard to find. But how were they to survive in a village without water? The fishermen of Chungungo could hardly have suspected that the solution to their problem was just above their heads. A cloud layer above the village caused mist to form in the mountains. The fishermen even had a name for it, Carmunchuca. They didn't realize that this Carmunchuca could be harvested, as Sarah Sita's team intended to do. One of the most important questions the scientists had worked on was what shape the net should be. The most efficient turned out to be a complicated diamond-shaped structure, which allowed the moist wind to pass through it from all sides. But they quickly realized that the design would have to be a lot simpler. In the long run, the fishermen of Chungungo would have to maintain the net themselves using techniques and materials they were familiar with. The diamond shape became a fishing net made of polypropylene gauze that was used in the village to make partitions. To everyone's surprise, the material turned out to be a very efficient fog catcher. The process is simple. Tiny water droplets are blown onto the gauze by the wind, and they merge to become bigger drops. 10 million tiny droplets form a drop of water the size of a teardrop. Up to 50% of the water in the fog can be harvested like this.
I don't remember everything, but people were very happy. I was an old woman, of course, who didn't believe in clean water. It was delivered in a giant pipe. We made tea right away. It was marvellous. But of course, water from above can't be wrong.
First and foremost, the project was a scientific project. The researchers had built and maintained the installation themselves. And of course, they had a budget for it too. But once the installation had been handed over to the villagers, that budget would dry up. And that proved to be a problem. In the village, a committee was formed to look after the collection of fees. This committee had to adopt strong measures because although the fishermen wanted to pay, they couldn't. Without regular maintenance, the drinking water system deteriorated visibly. The efforts of the Water Committee alone were not enough to prevent it, and there simply wasn't the money to take on anybody else. Here, too, drought turned out to be first and foremost a problem of poverty. All hope was not yet lost. The Chileans were convinced that instead of nets, trees could be used to collect water from fog. Peruvian scientists had reached the same conclusion. In various locations along the Peruvian coast, there are definite clues that the idea of collecting water from mist isn't as new as it had seemed.
En este momento, lo que estamos viendo es
what we see here is a desert. But you can also clearly see that the situation used to be very different.
Hay terrazas de cultivo, hay
You see terraces for agriculture,
también se ven restos de
settlements, and even enclosures for livestock.
lugares como este en todo
You find these sorts of clues a lot here in the desert, and yet the climate wasn't very different then.
Antes evidentemente debe haber
It may have rained a bit more, but it can't have been very
no
much.
era una cantidad muy grande. Siempre debe
The
haber
climate
sido
has
un clima
always
más o
been
menos
like
como es
this.
ahora, sí. Y para hacer
And for
agricultura,
growing
para
crops,
que
for
viviera la
people,
gente
or
y tuviera
even
su
tending
ganado,
livestock,
era
there
necesario que
had to
hubiera
be a
agua.
lot of water.
Esa agua dulce tiene que haber
The
venido
fresh water
de las
probably came from
montañas
the
del
mountains
entorno,
behind,
en donde hay
where we can still find remains
todavía
of the
parches,
forests.
hay relictos de bosque.
The Peruvians were doing research into plants able to live off their own water supply. They wondered how much water a particular tree could collect. In this way, they were able to select the trees suited to be used in reforestation. In the end, they succeeded in creating 10 hectares of forest able to survive by itself. And there are plans for bigger projects. Ultimately, they hope to make the forest big enough to produce more water than it needs for itself. The surplus will create little streams which can be used to drink and other purposes.
Water is never just a meteorological problem. It is never just a shortage of water. In the desert too, there is water, and nature knows how to make use of that. Even in the driest spot on Earth, you can find water. And with that water, you can break the vicious circle.